welcome to Musicians versus the World. I am so excited for our guest today. She has done some amazing research and she's here to share it with us. Her name is Dr. Beibei Lin. And Dr. Beibei Lin joins us from Valdosta State University. She is first and foremost dedicated to the development, growth, and success of her students and considers teaching her highest calling and greatest privilege. She was awarded the Steinway & Sons Top Teacher Award in 2017 in recognition of her teaching. Dr. Lin completed her Doctor of Music in Piano Performance and Master of Music in Piano Pedagogy and Performance from the Florida State University. She completed her Bachelor of Music summa cum laude in Piano Performance at Arizona State University. Her piano mentors include Heidi Louise Williams and Walter Kosand. Dr. Lin maintains an active performance schedule. She debuted as a soloist with the Masterworks Festival Orchestra at age 17, performing Prokofiev's first piano concerto under the direction of Miriam Burns. She has presented solo and collaborative guest recitals and masterclasses at institutions throughout the United States. As a researcher, Dr. Lin's work on the pedagogical trends in 21st century China was published in the Francis Clark Center for Keyboard Pedagogy Forum. She actively contributes to recent scholarship through performances and presentations at national conferences, including the Sport Professionals Experience and Research Conferences. So, Dr. Lin, welcome to Musicians versus the World.
Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for being interested in my research.
Well, your research is just wonderful. I'm so excited to jump into it. But first, I would love to hear a little bit more about you. Like we've said, you do performances, you are a well-respected teacher, you do all this research. Have you always been interested in music, or did you just kind of fall into it?
I think that I grew up in a family that really loved music and loved the arts. I am Chinese, and my story is perhaps a little unusual to American ears, but less unusual to Chinese ears. My parents came to America when they were My parents came to America as graduate students, and my dad came when my mom was pregnant with me. My mom came when I was 13 months old. So that meant that I was left in China with my grandparents, and I was raised by my grandparents. They were working professionals at that point. They were young grandparents. My grandfather was a professor of computers, and my grandmother was a doctor, an ENT doctor. But they both really loved the arts. My grandfather had a younger sibling, a sister, that was well known for performing in Chinese opera. And so just being in that environment, my grandfather was always singing. There was always music in the family. Then coming to America, I came and lived with my mother, and she loved music as well. I remember being dragged to every symphony concert, every Broadway musical, literally every production that we had in town, we had to go and watch it. And classical music, symphonies, solo piano works were constantly on in the home. And so she really nurtured that in me. And when I asked for piano lessons and I initiated that, she was more than happy to provide it, with one caveat, which is once I start something, I am not allowed to quit.
No.
And so as a young child, I thought, sure, I am not a quitter.
Of course.
Inevitably, every child, I am, fairly typical. I asked to quit a few years in, but she insisted. She said, remember that promise you made at the very beginning, that if you start something, you will not quit. And so I continued, and I'm so grateful that she was faithful to holding me to that promise, and really helped me to persevere through that period in my life, and found teachers that honed my love for music and helped me to see that it was not just work. You get to a certain age and you think that music is simply work, but music is a privilege. Music is an honor. And so she helped find teachers to hone that in me. And then, of course, my teachers rose to the occasion and really inspired me. And that's how I kind of got to where I am today, the work of my mother and my teachers.
Wow. And now you inspire that in your own students as well.
I hope so. You should ask them. Maybe they will disagree.
Well, what you said actually really interests me. How do you foster that impression that music really is an honor? How do you do that with your students?
You know, history teaches a lot
Hmm.
about the struggles that people have gone through in order to be a musician.
Uh-huh.
There are sacrifices that have been made so that we can have the music that we have today. Really inspiring and courageous sacrifices. I am Chinese.
Hmm.
And so, if we even look at the fairly recent history, and we'll start talking about my research in a little bit, but during the Cultural Revolution, it was unsafe for people to study Western classical music. Um,
Mm.
there are there were musicians who were imprisoned, who were persecuted, uh, musicians who were killed because they studied Beethoven and
Wow.
Bach and Mozart. And I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and I remember growing up. The conductor of our symphony was a Chinese man, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but he left after several years of being there. I think he went on to California. So maybe someone with Google savvy can search Wichita, Kansas, California conductor, Chinese man, and figure out who it is. But I remember hearing his personal story that he was sent to a re education camp as a musician, and he would study Beethoven symphony scores in secret, in the night,
Wow.
in the dark. And so, there are people who have sacrificed so much for the privilege, for the honor of being a musician and sharing music with the world. And that touches me deeply. I have not had to make those types of sacrifices. I have not been placed in those positions, but I can certainly be grateful that there are people who love music so deeply that they are willing to put everything in the line because they see that music is good for the soul, is good for humanity, and that one day their trials will be over and they will be able to share music again with the world. So, if you look at the first generation of Chinese that came out of China after China opened. I mean, they all have their stories, but a lot of the musicians, they came out of great hardship.
Mm.
For and they endured, they persevered with the hope that one day they can freely play music. It's just such a marvelous story to remind ourselves of.
Wow. That is a beautiful story. That's amazing. And that's one of the reasons that I love your research so much is because I personally don't know much about the musical traditions and the musical trends that have been happening in China. And so I would love it. Can you explain a little bit about the recent research that you've been doing?
Yeah, so it started really with my doctoral studies. You play piano, you give recitals, you take your classes, and then you get towards the end of your studies, and you're like, "Oh no, I have to do a big research project. I have to write a document. And what am I going to write about? What can I contribute to the world of scholarship that is interesting and useful and
Hmm.
meaningful to people?" And so you kind of sit down and you evaluate what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what kind of classes you have taken, or in my case, what kind of classes I have taken, and how, I really thought of this research project as a synthesis, as a culmination of all that I am as a scholar, as an academic, and as a musician. And one part of who I am is the fact that I am an immigrant and I am a Chinese. And so I started thinking about that and having conversations with my major professor, Heidi Williams. And we just thought, something exciting is happening in China. We see it when it's audition season in America for conservatories. They are getting, or they were, the COVID really threw a wrench in everything, but they
Uh-huh.
were getting just a lot of applications from Chinese students, and they were all outstanding. It didn't really matter
Mm.
what conservatory they were coming from. If they were coming from any one of the conservatories in China, they were well prepared.
Mm.
Their technical ability was just a different level, and they really had their pick of which schools they wanted to go to and what scholarship offers they wanted to accept. And so I started kind of looking at what research was out there and realized that a lot of it was newspaper articles, but no formal set research.
Right.
And there were some books, but they were not quite as recent. They kind of date back to the 60s to the 80s, and nothing really evaluating what has been happening in the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I kind of embarked on that journey to kind of evaluate what is happening in China, that they are producing so many pianists there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that leads you to the research of China and its Gilded Age, and how there are very many similarities between actually China's Gilded Age and America's Gilded Age. And I love this because, with all of the different cultures and political things that are happening, it just kind of shows that music really, we're not that different when it comes to music and the love of music and things of that nature. So just as a little background, can you explain a little bit the concept of Gilded Age?
Sure. When we think of the term Gilded Age, we have to think of the word gilded and where it comes from. It really is Shakespearean in its root. He had talked about in one of his plays something to the effect of gilding gold or painting a lily. And so this idea of something that is beautiful, and then you put something even more beautiful on top of it, that there's a sense of excess to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't really need to dress up a lily,
Right.
A lily in and of itself is already beautiful. Okay, so when we think about the Gilded Age, what it's really signifying is that's a time of excess. It's a time of political excess, economic excess, social excess. And so when we look at, for example, the American Gilded Age, it comes immediately after the American Civil War. There's a lot of infrastructure that is being built, a lot of money that is being spent. And suddenly when we think of the money that is being spent in terms of building infrastructure, that allows for a lot of opportunities for economic growth, for someone to go from a lower class to middle class to upper class. We get stories of great developments of individual wealth during that time period. We think of some of the music halls that were being built back then. I think, Carnegie Hall was built around then. They really just put a lot of money into everything. Everything was over the top. And so when we look at the numbers of music study during the Gilded Age, that was the peak of piano study in America. It was like every household, if they weren't taking music lessons, they hoped to one day be able to take music lessons.
Right.
And when we look at things like the piano production that was happening for a long time, piano production was happening in Europe. But once the Gilded Age hit in America, piano production in America skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
We can trace that. Okay, so when we shift our focus to China, we
Mm-hmm.
see a lot of similarities in that. And the disruption that happened in America was the Civil War, but in China was the Cultural Revolution. They really kind of obliterated a lot of the traditions, a lot of the histories, a lot of the social bonds that had previously existed.
Mm-hmm.
China is an old country, but in a way, it's a kind of new country. If you go to visit China, you go to Chinese cities, you realize, wow, there are a lot of buildings that have been built in the last 2 years, 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
10 years. And so sure, we have our ancient structures, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of those ancient structures are actually gone, and they've been replaced by a lot of new structures. Okay, so we're starting to see that infrastructure is being built. Money is being poured in. The ability to climb social class is possible. You can go from someone who is a farmer from the countryside to the top of either the political system or the economic system. And so the opportunity is there. And then when we shift the focus to what is happening in China musically, we start to see, oh, in a way, it's very similar to America. If the kid is not taking music lessons,
Mm-hmm.
the aspiration is that one day the kid can take music lessons that the family can afford. When we look at things like piano production. Okay, so before it was produced in Europe, then during the American Gilded Age, it was produced in America. Well, a huge amount of our piano production internationally has shifted to China.
Right.
And all these companies are making or building factories in China. It might not be Chinese brands, it might be Japanese brands or German brands, but they are building factories. And of course, there are Chinese brands. So they're also building pianos. And so there are those types of parallels that we see socially and musically in the Gilded Age for both countries.
Oh, that's amazing. That's wonderful. And so you're seeing, because there's so much growth, that the quality of music teaching and the quality of students coming from China is really increasing as well.
It's high. It's incredibly high. And I think that we can see that in the numbers if we examine the percentage of students that are coming from mainland China at some of our top universities. They make up a fairly significant chunk of their piano studio population. The other instrument that Chinese students really gravitate towards is violin. And so the question has to be, why those types of instruments? Why piano? Why violin? And they're really gravitating towards the virtuosity of those instruments, the external visible virtuosity. I mean, I would be the first one to say that something like trumpet or French horn is very virtuosic. Right. And I can't even imagine learning something that is so internal. So much of what happens in your internal muscles, right. But there's something very external about playing a piano or playing a violin and the movement of the bow. Yeah. And so they're gravitating towards that. And because it's the virtuosity of the instrument that is attracting them, there is a drive to meet that virtuosity. You see, to rise to the demands, because it's that very demand that is attracting them. And so they work incredibly hard. I was thinking that in a way, they have a set of motivations to succeed on a musical instrument that does not necessarily exist for a lot of American students.
Really,
it becomes a symbol of middle class, of achievement. It becomes a symbol of social status and economic status. And that can be a great motivator, not only for the student, but for the parents behind the student. You see, parents are so influential. And so if parents are driven to have their child succeed on a certain instrument, they will know how to push that student to achieve that. Whereas in America, a lot of parents, I hear this frequently. Parents will say, I just want my child to enjoy it, have fun. And so there is not this equating musical achievement to defining social status for the child or for the family. And so they have an element of motivation that really cannot be recreated here.
Right. Now, is that because America's kind of that post-Gilded Age? Is that why we don't have those same?
Yeah, I think so.
Kind of like the underdog sort of motivation that people tend to have.
Yeah, exactly. If you're coming from behind, then you will work so much harder to achieve, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like the second child syndrome.
Yeah.
Where you're watching your older brother achieve something and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to work twice as hard because I've got to be better than my brother.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something deeply human about the motivational power of competition, definitely.
So these students that are coming to America to come to these schools and conservatories, are they then going back to China or are they staying here? Did you do any research in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think overall the trend is, for a long time, Chinese students came and they intended to stay in America. America was the dream, it was the ultimate destination. And so those students are, for example, my parents' generation. They came with intent. My mother will say that when she first left China, the moment she stepped out of China, she said, "I'm never coming back again." Okay,
Wow.
because life was so difficult in
Right.
China back then. But as China has opened up to the West and really developed in the last 2, 3 decades, the attraction of going back to China has increased. And we see that not just with musicians, but with really students of every discipline, scientists, researchers. They all see that there might be more economic opportunities in China rather than in America. And so the draw of going back is greater and greater. And I see more and more students coming to America with the plan of going back rather than staying. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Was there anything in your research that surprised you that you weren't expecting to find?
I went into this research not really with the Gilded Age topic in mind. I
Mm-hmm.
went into this research because I just wanted to learn about what was happening on the pre-collegiate level in China. And it was only through reading and speaking with the teachers and the students that I started to see this parallel percolate. And
Oh, okay.
it probably, for a lot of us, when we start to make these connections, it kind of exists in our subconscious. And one day it just kind of breaks through and you sit down. And I remember sitting down and thinking to myself, something is happening here. There are parallels. And that's when I started digging in, what was happening with infrastructure during Gilded Age? What's happening with infrastructure in China? What's happening in wealth accumulation during the Gilded Age? What's happening? And I started finding the numbers. What's happening in piano building here and there? And suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, this parallel exists. And that was after I had done all of these interviews, spoke to all of these teachers, traveled throughout China to do that. And so it really had to kind of sit in my mind for a while for it to show up. And when it did show up, it caused all sorts of goosebumps and excitements. But that was actually the most surprising thing, because I did not realize that there was this parallel going into this research.
Yeah. And I found, when I was reading your research about this, what I found so interesting was some of the attitudes that Europeans had towards Americans in their Gilded Age are very similar to some of the attitudes that Americans have towards Chinese instrumentalists in their Gilded Age. So one of the quotes that I thought was really, really great is, what Long Long actually said. He said that some of the things that you were saying just right now, that you said 200 years ago it was Europe, 100 years ago it was America, 50 years ago it was Japan, and now it's China. I think that just goes along straight with what you're saying, and how these trends of the popularity of classical music just kind of follow along with these Gilded Ages. I love that. And then one more that I thought was very, very interesting was that the irony inherent in the old stereotype is that these fleet-fingered impersonal performers replicated the values of a Western conservatory system that has long emphasized sheer technique at the expense of all else. The world was, in effect, scapegoating Asians for its own defects. And that was from Alex Ross in the New Yorker, April 2nd, 2007. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, one of the interesting things is, for all the accusations that are thrown at Asian musicians, and a lot of times it's not just Chinese, it's a blanket statement about their technique and their emphasis on technique. The Western world has rewarded them time and again for their ability to master technique. We reward them by accepting them into our conservatories. We reward them by giving them a lot of scholarship money. We reward them by picking them as the winners of these Western competitions. We reward them by signing contracts. And so we can sit in the back seat and criticize, but actions speak louder than words. And it seems like, even though there is a verbal criticism of this emphasis, our actions collectively as a culture is to continually reward that. Now, I do want to say that there are really some fine musicians, deep, musical, thoughtful, musicians who are Chinese, because they have been the beneficiaries of teachers that nurture the whole student rather than focusing just on etudes and exercises. And so we can't really make blanket statements either way, but it is interesting to think about how the perception from the outside is, well, you might criticize, but you're actually giving us a lot of awards for all of our technical achievements.
Yes. We're kind of, yeah. Well, and also it is a stereotype. And if you kind of go into something with that thought that that's going to happen, then you start looking for it more, and you might be missing out on some of the really thoughtful and beautiful musical performances that are out there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I think that there's something deeply human about our ability to criticize others and our inability to look inward to evaluate ourselves and our history. And I think that applies to not just humans, but entire societies, right? It's very easy to look externally to criticize other cultures or other histories, and it's very difficult to evaluate inwardly because we are blind to our own weaknesses. We are blind to we just don't know. I remember one of my teachers once said, the worst thing about being deceived is you don't know that you are deceived. The worst thing about having a weakness is you don't realize that you have that weakness. I think that same thing applies. And so what applies on the human level applies on a cultural level. It's easy for us to look at other cultures and say, oh, we see their deficiencies. But it's difficult for us to evaluate our own history and realize, oh, wait, we might have had the same deficiencies once upon a time.
What do you think the main takeaway for performers or teachers today? What's something that we can gain from all of your research that will help us in the future?
I think it's important to not discount musicians coming from the developing world. And that doesn't just apply to China anymore. China is really powerful economically and politically nowadays. And so there will be other countries that rise up. History repeats itself. Okay. History goes in cycles. What's it? Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And so as we look into the future, there will be a new culture, a new country that will raise up a new generation of musicians. And we will think to ourselves, what does that country have to offer? They are poor. They do not have a history in classical music. And I think that if we learn a lesson from what has happened in China is to not look down our noses at the musicians who are coming out of developing countries. And it goes back to what I said earlier. It's because they have a source of motivation that is irreplaceable, that cannot be reproduced in an already developed country. You see, music means something to them on a social and economic level that we cannot recreate here in America. And maybe one day we will not be able to recreate in China too. They will achieve that level of economic stability where piano is no longer that symbol. It's replaced by something else. And so one, don't discount the musicians coming from developing countries. And then two, I think that it will be increasingly difficult to grow the number of musicians that we have in America. And so what we have learned is to recruit students and musicians from China. But eventually that will run dry. And I think COVID has been a kind of game changer in that. A lot of people are afraid to leave China now. They don't really want to come to America. And so the numbers to watch for the next few years in terms of recruitment from China will be very interesting to see how it impacts our music and specifically piano studios here in America, and whether that reliance on Chinese talent might end up hurting us because we haven't nurtured local talent, domestic talent in the same way. So then the lesson that we must learn, if that happens, if the numbers continue to drop, and I just pulled up some numbers about international students a couple days ago in preparation for our interview, and sure enough, the drop has been fairly precipitous across the board from every country, studying every field, but the fine arts have been really quite severely hit, and Chinese students have seen one of the largest declines in terms of international students coming to America. So one of the lessons that we have to learn from this is we must be very intentional about fostering good, solid, quality talent here locally, domestically. And so we're not looking for numbers anymore. We must look for depth in our students.
Do you have any ideas of how we can do that? Because we don't have that same underdog sort of feel anymore. We're pretty well established here in America. What sort of ideas do you have to foster that type of drive and high quality student?
You know what I find motivates my students the most is success. And success is not defined by winning competitions or getting a certificate or getting a trophy. Success is really overcoming something that they had no idea that they could overcome before, right? And I've been thinking about this, as teachers, we can in some ways see the potential of our students much better than our students can see their own potential.
Right.
Why is that? It's because I've met a lot more 9-year-olds and I've watched them go from 9 to 10, and I know what they can do in that age gap than most of my 9-year-olds have seen. They haven't traced that development. So they haven't done that analysis to think where I am now and where I am going, or what my teacher thinks I am going to be able to do. That is possible. Okay. So we as teachers must believe that that's possible for our students. We must let them know that that's possible. And we also must give them the tools to achieve that potential. And that tool, unfortunately, there is no great secret to it. It's simply hard work. Okay. So I recently had a student that showed up to a lesson, a wonderful student. I love him to pieces. He's 10 years old and he's very consistent about practicing. He does a solid hour every day. So most teachers would be happy with that.
Yes.
And he shows up to the lesson and he plays the same old thing that he's played before. And nothing has changed. And I told him, you are better than this. You don't delay your struggle of learning new portions to your P's. Do not procrastinate on that challenge. Confront that challenge. See what you are capable of. Okay. And so I speak to all of my students as if they are adults. I treat them as adults. I expect them to mature into adults. And so I want them to practice learning responsibility, learning the cost of procrastination. I said, this is the cost of your procrastination. It just means that next week you're going to have double the amount because I'm not lowering my expectations for you. I know what you could have achieved this week. I know what you can achieve in the next week. And now you just have to do a double dose of the work because you delayed in confronting new sections of your music. And several days later, his mom texted me and said, he was on his 4th hour of practicing that day.
Oh my goodness.
So
my goodness.
That might seem a little excessive, but then
I think that's amazing.
Yeah, even yesterday, she just texted me and said he had finished math and that he was not particularly enjoying math, and asked his mom if he could go play piano instead. And then he said, I would rather practice 10 hours of piano than do another minute of math.
Oh my goodness. How cute
but
is
it's
that?
because he had shown up to his lesson and then he had done great. He had done well. And when I say that he has done well, I do not lie to him. When I say, this is a great lesson. You have met my expectation. You have done a good job. He knows that I am not just saying filler words. I really mean it. And so he has succeeded. And I have shown him the tools of success. Doing what is difficult, being diligent, and not procrastinating on the hard things. And so it doesn't matter to me whether or not he ends up becoming a professional musician, but I guarantee you, I am fairly confident on this, that he will be a great appreciator of musicians and great appreciator of music in his future.
And that's a good mom too, to not make excuses for him, but to say, okay, yes, you need to do what your teacher tells you.
Yes.
So you've trained his parents as well as just as well as you frightened him as well.
I have a good relationship with all of the parents of my students. We communicate regularly. We communicate about their schoolwork. We communicate about their struggles. If they're giving attitude at home, I come alongside them and I help them and be like, hey, attitude adjustment. And so it really is a partnership, and it's a relationship of trust. And so we have that open. Yeah.
Yes. So what is next for your research? What's your next big interest that you're kind of jumping into?
Well, there are always pieces that need to be learned.
Uh-huh.
We learn recital programs faster. So there are always things I need to practice.
Yes.
I think that the main focus of my projects right now, one is the Georgia Music Teachers Association podcast that I've been hosting. And it's very low key, but it's been a lot of fun. And I've been speaking with music teachers around Georgia. And that, that takes up time. That takes up a huge chunk of my time, emailing, recruiting people to talk to me, and then editing and putting it out there. So that's one thing. The other thing I mentioned earlier is I think it would be really interesting to see the effects of COVID on international student recruitment into the future, especially at the upper echelon of music study, the elite conservatories and universities that have recruited a lot of Chinese students, and ask ourselves, are they able to be as successful now during COVID as they were before pre-COVID? I think that will be an eye-opening investigation.
That would be interesting, because I know, speaking with some of my professor friends, that there have been a lot of students that are overseas that have done everything virtually all throughout COVID. So they've been doing their bachelor's and master's degree completely online. And it would be very interesting to see how their outcomes have become.
Yeah, I will just say that on a personal level, I still have family back home. I speak regularly with my grandma, and my grandma comes to visit me every so often, and she'll stay for long stretches of time. But she's really concerned about COVID, and so she really has no interest in returning to the States. And she kind of voices that. On behalf of friends that she knows, they have grandkids who really don't want to leave the country anymore, either to come to America or to go to Europe or Australia. And those are actually places that have depended a lot on international Chinese students, Australia especially, because it's on that hemisphere.
So, yes.
Yeah. So that's going to be an interesting question to observe.
Yes. Well, when you get those results, we'll have to have you come back and tell us about it.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great. What's something that you've learned on your podcast? What's like the most interesting thing that's happened in your discussions?
Oh, there have been so many really wonderful stories. We think about Georgia Music Teachers Association, and we think that these teachers are from Georgia, but actually the body is very diverse. Many of them come from other states. Many of them come from other countries. And so their stories are really unique. And I've really enjoyed the diversity of teachers that I've been able to speak with and their experiences. So that's one. The other that has surprised me is I really like to ask them about their practice habits when they were young. And just about all of them, with maybe one or two exceptions, have said that practicing was not an issue for them as a child, that their parents never had to tell them to practice.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so I've been thinking about that. What has changed from back then to now? And I think part of it is I am interviewing a unique group of people, right? These are people who obviously went through their life and then decided that music is my thing. I'm going to pursue music. So they are professional musicians. So they already have a natural inclination towards music. But I also wonder if the other thing is the absence of technology.
Oh,
you see, back then, there was not as much source for entertainment. And piano really was their one source of entertainment. They talk about how fun it was to play duets with their neighbors, or to go over to someone's house. And, there was just nothing else to do. There were no video games. There might have been a TV, but, not as many options. and not as interesting programming. And so they just gravitated towards playing the piano because that was their closest thing to a video game that we might have today. You know, you do something and there's an effect. You do something and there's an effect.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I've been pondering on that, on perhaps technology has made practicing really quite challenging for our students.
Can't wait to hear what it is that you come up with. That'll be great. So what is the title of your podcast?
Georgia Music Teachers Association.
Perfect.
Just the GMTA. Fairly easy.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. And we'll have a link to that in our show notes. So anybody who's interested, it's a really, really fun podcast. And your guests are just really interesting with all of their stories. And you learn so much from it. And you do such a great job of hosting and talking with them.
Oh, thank you. You're very
yeah. So I'll definitely put a link to that and put a link to research and anything if people are more interested in this topic about what's happening in China and the similarities and all of the exciting things that are going on in the world of music. So thank you. Thank you so much for coming here. My last question is, what advice do you have if there is somebody out there that wants to do what you're doing and wants to be a professional musician and make their life dedicated to it? What advice would you give them?
Thank you so much for asking me this question. I am infamous among my friends for giving unsolicited advice. So the fact that you're soliciting advice from me is just fulfilling my dreams. I think it goes back to what my mother told me at the very beginning of my studies, which is don't quit. And I've really developed that attitude throughout my whole life. And it comes down to this. People quit because they're afraid of failing. And I just decided, I just remember as a middle schooler deciding that I would rather be a failure than a quitter. And I am not athletic at all. In middle school, my best friend told me that she wanted to run track and she didn't want to run track alone. And so she dragged me and we joined the middle school track team, and we were always the last, two girls running behind these other runners that were fantastic. And I remember thinking I could quit, or I can just be so bad that I am kicked off the team. Which one would I prefer? And I remember deciding I am going to just keep showing up to practice until I am kicked off the team. And I got kicked off the team. And I was so happy to be kicked off the team. I was waiting for that moment because I didn't want to quit. And then high school, my same best friend, I don't know what inspired her to do this because she's not athletic either. And she decided that we should join the swim team. And again, we were both just the slowest swimmers. I mean, I could swim, I could float, but I was just not athletic. And I just thought to myself, I am not going to quit. I'm going to face the embarrassment of being the worst one on the team. And I am going to just wait until the coach kicks us off the team. And finally, one day, he just pulled us aside and he was like, I'm sorry, but I don't think you girls are cut out to be swimmers. That was the happiest day of that year. I've just been waiting for that moment. And so that's been my attitude for just about everything, because I find that in other things, if I quit when I want to, a lot of times that moment of quitting comes right before my moment of success. So I must persevere past my desire of wanting to quit in order to taste any fruits of success. So I just decided, I would rather have people fail me. I would rather be embarrassed. I would rather be kicked off the team, be rejected, than to voluntarily quit. And that has worked out really well for me in life.
So just don't quit. Just keep working on it.
Yes. Don't quit. Don't quit. Yes.
Yep. And that music is a privilege.
Yes.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Well, Dr. Lin, thank you so much. Thank you for joining me and sharing your really interesting research and your advice and your optimism and enthusiasm. I just appreciate you so much. Thanks for making the time to come talk with me.
Thank you. This conversation has been fun for me, and thank you for taking the time to hear me.